for this program was provided by a grant from Exxon Corporation, by this station and other public television stations.
A conversation with Louis Lefkowitz next on WNET, Newark, New Jersey.
Colin Davis and the Boston Symphony Orchestra with soloist and chorus in Part 1 complete of Messiah by George Frederick Handel.
The Complete Messiah, Sunday night at 11:30 in stereo.
Ladies and gentlemen, Puccini's Tosca. A towering tale of passion, intrigue, and revolution, televised live from the Metropolitan Opera. The cast includes Shirley Verrett, Luciano Pavarotti, Cornell MacNeil, and Fernando Corina. Don't miss one of the world's great operas, Puccini's Tosca.
Rebroadcast Sunday at 2 a.m. and Monday at 2 p.m. Presentation of this program is made possible by a grant from the David J. Green Foundation.
Louis Lefkowitz retires at the end of 1978. It will end a unique career in New York politics. First as an assemblyman for Manhattan's Lower East Side, then as a judge, and for the last 22 years as Attorney General. Louis Lefkowitz has been a state fixture. Tonight, on this 13 special, we will examine that career in a conversation with Louis Lefkowitz. If you want to keep pace with Attorney General Louis Lefkowitz, it might be a good idea to wear sneakers. At the age of 74, his day begins at 7:30 with a brisk 2-mile walk. The early morning commuters along Park Avenue can set their watches by his good morning. He arrives at his office in the World Trade Center at 8 a.m. His political career began in 1927 when he won his first assembly race as a Republican from the Lower East Side. While in Albany, he got to know the governors, Alfred E. Smith and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When Herbert Lehman was governor, Lefkowitz was appointed a municipal court judge by New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. In 1954, Governor Tom Dewey appointed him judge of the city court. As Attorney General, he has served with Governors Averell Harriman, Nelson Rockefeller, Malcolm Wilson, and today, Hugh Carey. Mr. Lefkowitz, you served under every governor since Alfred Smith. Let's do, if we can, a free association. I'll name the governor. Tell me the first impression that comes to mind. Smith.
Man way ahead of his times who foresaw legislation that eventually came to fruition. And he recommended bills that didn't pass right away, but as years went by, they were enacted into law. A man with very little education, but a very practical person with good common sense and a fighter for what he believed in.
FDR.
Well, he was a little more of a disciplinarian. It had to be his way or no way. He was a very strong character who, if he felt he had something good, seldom compromised or saw another viewpoint. It had to be his legislation or his policies, and very little opportunity to get into change.
That wasn't the view of him when he became president.
Well, whatever the view is, I'm giving you my view, and during the short period I knew him, having served up in Albany with him.
As governor?
Correct.
Herbert Lehman.
Well, he's a very retiring gentleman, but a lot of class, very well educated, very sympathetic, very humane, very understanding, very patient, and whom you can sit around with and get him to see a viewpoint. A very unusual person who brought a lot of good knowledge and good background to his job.
Tom Dewey.
A very tough administrator, but an excellent administrator. People never realize one of the best administrators as a governor we've ever had. A good student who did his homework, who knew his work very well, who was a good preparer, who sat through a lot of meetings with the staff as they prepared things and participated in very fully.
Averell Harriman.
perfect gentleman who I think belonged more in the international field than as a governor. I think he enjoyed his gubernatorial work, but I always had the feeling that there were horizons way above that, where he belonged and where he should be, and events proved I'm right. Even to this very day, as we speak now, Kenny's on submission for the President of the United States, and I'm sure he gets along with people. Yes. He does very well with people, very tactful and very understanding and persuasive.
He wasn't very tactful. That I understand he once called you a mosquito.
He said, yeah, he said, in a campaign, so I replied, but yes, I'm a mosquito, buzzing around, trying to tell the people what I think they should hear on legislation, so I'll always speak my viewpoint. But we became good friends. As a matter of fact, after he left the governorship, he was honored by some German newspaper, and he asked that I be one of the speakers at the dinner for him, and I did, and I praised him. He said, that's funny. Only a couple of years ago when I was running for re-election, Louis didn't praise me. Now he's praising me.
Nelson Rockefeller.
Well, that's a man close to my heart, with whom I developed a great friendship. A man that should have been president of the United States. Great talents. I've yet to meet a person who has a knowledge of finance, business, arts, commerce, you name it, construction, housing. Great man. I worked very closely with him. Took his pad into a meeting, worked with everybody else. Always persuade him very often when he's wrong, but once the decision was made as to what he wanted, he stuck to it. But he made great contributions. Always walked in with an agenda. He never went to a meeting without saying, this is what I want to discuss. He had his ideas, but opened up the meeting for others to participate. A great official, and one of the things I got out of politics, if I may use that word, is to his friendship, which I still enjoy today, Ken.
Malcolm Wilson.
A very good student, I think, with more knowledge of state government than anyone I ever met. Him, it was a question of, not only because he was in the assembly, got to know it, but it was a study with him all the time. Knew his provisions of law and the Constitution, statutes. Mechanically, he was good, a parliamentarian. He was an excellent parliamentarian. An unusual, gifted student of government.
Of politics?
Well, he knew his politics. He started locally up in Yonkers, but regrettably, in the campaign to run for governor, it didn't click. He lost, as you know.
The incumbent, you carry.
Well, he's a very smart and able fellow who has a quick mind, good wit, got some good cracks that puts people in their place. I don't find him making notes very often, but he seems to retain things.
Why is that significant to you?
Well, I tell you, I run an office here with 460 lawyers. No head can come into my office without a pad or paper. That's why I got 6, 7 pads on my table. When I start giving them some suggestions for what to do, policy or otherwise, unless they make notes, I say, look, you're going to forget. Don't come in here without a pad, or don't leave without a pad and write down what I've asked you to do. Now, Carrie has a good memory, a good mind, but there's so many things can happen after you have a meeting which may distract and keep your mind away. I prefer having people making a note, take it out. I carry a card with me. I've got a card for every day this week, and I'll make notes for the next few days. And you come, first it relieves your mind if you jot it down. You don't have to carry it up at your head. Secondly, it's a good reminder to do it. If you want to postpone it, just shift it to another day's another card. But I've a good relationship with Governor Carey, not the same as I had with the others. Different political parties. I've served under 2 Democratic governors, Governor Harriman and Governor Carey. So legally, I've given my advice. Judah Gribbets is in touch with me quite often. No problem. We don't socialize. Doesn't call me in on policy questions as much as Governor Rockefeller did and Governor Wilson, but that's understandable.
Tell us about the first meeting you ever had with Alfred Smith.
Oh, bring me back to 1928, the opening day of the session, Ken.
You were then elected as a freshman assemblyman.
And a Republican. Don't leave that out, because that was treason. For a Republican to be elected on the Lower East Side of Manhattan was treason. I say treason because north of my district was the famous district of Charles F. Murphy, a legend in Tammany Hall. And Bill Keneally succeeded him. Over to the south was a very famous Ahern district. And just below the Ahern district was Alfred E. Smith's Fulton Fish Market. A little bit further west was Dr. Goldenkrantz, and beyond that, Jimmy Walker's area. And for a Republican to win was treason. I use that word advisedly. I'll never forget the headlines in the papers. East Side Republican was elected. It's a true story. I was asked to run for the Assembly. I was a starving lawyer at the time, and I said to my political mentor, Sam Koenig, who was former Secretary of State, I don't have a nickel to buy a throwaway or to print my literature. Don't have me run. I'm starving now. He said, look, don't worry, you can't win. So I said, why do you want me to run if I can't win? He said, well, try anyway. So I tried. I took it seriously. I got every young man, every girl I knew, every fellow. I was unmarried then, so I was still an eligible guy with the girls, Ken. And I got
Can't call them girls anymore.
No more. Listen, we're talking now about 1927 when I ran for office. Now it'd be a mistake. I'd lose votes if I called them girls. I told them all to knock at every door, so we practically covered every household from Stanton to 17th, from the East River to First Avenue. I got enough people to knock at every door once or twice, say, will you please vote for my friend Louis Lefkowitz? And I said, you're going to be told, tell him not to waste his time. This is a Democratic district. And each time I wish to tell these people, you want to get a respectable vote. Well, they got so many respectable votes, I was elected, Ken. Now, getting back to Alfred E. Smith, he sent me the opening day. This was a great man, way ahead of his time. He should have been president of the United States. He said, are you the young man that was elected down the Lower East Side? Yes, sir. Were you elected as a Republican? I said, yes, sir. Well, this time I started to worry that maybe the certificate would be taken away. He said, listen, young man, don't you ever get elected again? Well, now I was really through. He says, now, take it easy. All I mean is don't ever get elected again as a Republican. Great man. I knew his family because I'd gone to law school with Alfred E. Smith, Jr. at Fordham Law School, right?
Let's talk about another legend, Fiorello LaGuardia. The mayor of New York appointed you a judge.
As a judge in 1935 to what we called then the municipal court. That was a poor man's court with jurisdiction of up to $1,000, only civil jurisdiction. Great character, oh, what a great man. And yeah, it was comical to a lot of people, but he gave orders, and tough man, disciplinarian, sometimes would disregard the laws, and just when he wanted to get things done. The day I became a judge, I know I got a call at midnight one night. Would you like to become a judge? I said, sure, why not? Come down the next day at 9. I was there at 9 o'clock. I didn't sleep all night, Ken, to make sure I'd be there at 9 o'clock. He was nowhere around until 10 o'clock. He came out of his office and started to abuse me for being late. And I said, Major, I always called him Major. I'd been a major in the Air Force. And I said, look, I've been here since 9. He said, no, you haven't. I said to myself, I better keep quiet before he changed his mind. But a great campaigner. Then I was his lawyer in 1941. We had a very bitter primary fight for the Republican nomination for mayor. John R. Davies, a Republican, entered the primary against Mayor LaGuardia. And I represented Mayor LaGuardia for about 6-7 weeks between petitions and trials in the appellate courts. The case was before the late Judge Pecora. He'd call me up 3, 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me how the trial was going. Then start giving me advice. I said, look, you weren't there all day. You don't know what the testimony is. How can you give advice? Well, forget it. He was a lawyer, you know, but never practiced. Not too much anyway. Very unusual. You'll never see another like that. You know about him reading comics, and you've heard all those stories. Sure. Going every fire, putting on a fireman's hat, giving orders there. And a very unusual person who worked hard. Was a good mayor.
When he appointed you to a judgeship, how did that appointment come about? It came through the political organization?
Well, I was a member of I'd been a member of the Assembly. He knew of me, appointed me in 1935, knew of my existence. I guess, I'm pretty sure my name was recommended by the late Sam Caney, who was my political mentor. And then I got the call.
And who was also the Republican county chairman?
County chairman and former Secretary of State. I'm pretty sure that's how it happened.
Louis Lefkowitz has said that an incumbent is always running by the way he performs while in office. Lefkowitz invented some of the mandatory stops on the New York campaign trail. We took him back to Ratner's on the Lower East Side, where he introduced Nelson Rockefeller to Blintz's. The first time Nelson Rockefeller ran for governor, 58, was something of a stiff. You took him by the arm, and he became Rocky.
Well, stiff in the sense that the polls showed he was minus almost 500,000 votes as late as right after Labor Day. And I didn't know him at all. We weren't brought up together, as you probably know, and he's got a couple of dollars more than I have, Ken. At any rate, I met him for the first time. We ran together in 1958. To me, it was Mr. Rockefeller. Well, I got him after Labor Day, and I went up to see him. I said, look, you're not going anywhere. You're spending a lot of money for Madison Avenue. Nothing is going over. I'm told the poll has got you behind. Will you please come with me somewhere you never were in your life, or your father or your grandfather? He says, where? And I had to describe the Lower East Side to him. And so I took him down to Delancey Street, which was then pretty much of a good, solid Jewish area, and working people, labor class. I said, this would be a great novelty there, but I want you to come and eat in some places with me, too. And again, I said, look, you're going to be eating food I'm sure you never had at home.
Bring an Alka-Seltzer.
So, or have it during the meal. So at any rate, I took him into Ratner's, and he had a combination. I'd never asked him this very day whether he was up all night. He had herring for the beginning, potato soup, and then blintzes. That's a bad combination, Ken. I never tried that myself, maybe one at a time, every other week. But then we started the campaign, and it clicked real well from that point on. We hit every newspaper, and then it was a great campaign. I'll give you one or two quick stories, Ken. He said, what do you do? I said, you got to get down and put your hand out and shake hands with people. And he took to it very fast. He's a great human being. He was very friendly. And I remember we met a little old Jewish woman, God bless her, maybe in the 70s or 80s, who wanted an apartment. And Rockefeller gave her that long litany of the fact that there'd be a referendum on a ballot, and if that passed, then legislation would pass, then maybe she'd get her apartment. She listened to this, she finally said to him, when he kept saying, if that all happened, she'd get an apartment, she said, I should live so long? That was our reply to him. But then we went into a delicatessen store, and the fellow to make an impression, he heard a Rockefeller was coming. Instead of charging him, I think, $5 for a salami, he charged him $4.18 or $4.20, whatever it was. And he paid it, and alongside was a fellow who had just bought a salami for $5. Did he raise the devil? He's Mr. Rockefeller, you save money, and me you make pay $5. When we started the campaign together, we hit it up pretty well, and the rest is history. Great campaign, a great human being.
In fact, he went down this summer with you, back to Ratner's.
Yes, we go down. We never let the press know, the news media. We go down to Ratner's once or twice a year. Just about 8 weeks ago, more or less, we went down. Had a quiet lunch and sat there for about 2 hours. But believe it or not, Kenny, so many people recognize us. He said, let's go, Louis. I said, where? Let's go around. So we made some of the tables shaking hands. He wasn't running, and I wasn't running either. I had already announced I wasn't running for re-election. But once people saw him, he said, oh, let's do it. So he enjoyed doing it very much, and he enjoyed the luncheon we had, too. It wasn't the old combination of herring soup and blintzes, just blintzes.
What is his mood like now? I mean, here's a man at 70 years old, was the titular and real head of the state Republican Party, ran for president, yet his name was hardly mentioned at the recent state Republican nominating convention. Is he sulking?
Well, I'll say I mentioned his name, paid my respects to him. I did that in my speech. Well, let's say he's quite upset at some utterances made by some county chairman that they felt they didn't need him anymore. Secondly, he took that on face value. He said, if I'm through in politics, I don't want to participate. He's very busy now with some of his private work, reproducing works of art, active with the Brothers Foundation. I see him occasionally up there, or when I meet him for lunch, I'll call for him, he'd come down, and I'll meet him downtown. He's very happy with what he's doing. That's keeping him pretty occupied. I would hope, although I think it's just a hope that I have that may not bear fruition, that he would get active again, because that was part of his life. He did love government. He did love to campaign. He loved people. He loved to get into debates. He loved to express himself. So I'm hoping that, I think it'll be good therapy for him if he did, but that's a personal decision he's going to make. I don't press him, Ken.
But he needs therapy.
He's got therapy where he is, but I think he's got so much energy. God bless him. He's such a strong character, strong person. I think this became part of his life. He doesn't tell me he's missing it. I get the feeling, though, that without saying he's missing it, I think it's such a part of his life that he would enjoy doing it again, and I hope he would.
The Republican candidate for governor, Perry Duryea, has not been known as a friend of Nelson Rockefeller's, nor vice versa. Do you expect he'll endorse and work for Duryea?
I don't know. As of this moment, I'd say he's not going to get active at all. There's some hope that he will, but as of this moment, his strong pronouncements to me are very plain. Louis, I'm not going to get active in a campaign. I'm not going to do any campaigning. That's the last thing he told me, and it could change. That will be a decision for him to make.
Who was the greatest person you ever met?
I'm a little prejudiced. To me, it's Rockefeller all the time. You see, Ken, I had the unusual opportunity to work at close range. It was so close I even had a room at the mansion. Of course, that spoiled me a little bit. I wasn't brought up in a mansion. I'd have a fellow knock at the door in the morning and say, what do you want for breakfast?
It was the governor?
No.
Oh.
A fellow, Robert, who's still at the mansion. But then I had dinners there whenever he invited me to eat breakfast all the time. I sat through meetings with him. I got such a great opportunity to observe this man in action with his vast knowledge. And I left out international affairs before. He served under 4 presidents. This fellow had great knowledge, and he speaks several languages. And to hear him expressing what was great, that he grasped things very fast. He always had several lawyers against him. He did very well against the lawyers. Wilson was a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, Bob Douglas. And before him, Sal Corbin, Bob McCrae, a lot of people around him, but he picked things just very fast. A great man, a great humanitarian. It's a great family, and the whole family is great because I worked very close with him. So as far as I'm concerned, I always put him in that class, only because I had a chance to observe him. Good family man, can talk to him, and I never called him Nelson, except when we're alone, it's Nelson. Otherwise, always Governor.
Where Louis Lefkowitz grew up, there were no mansions or servants. He was born on 6th Street between Avenue C and D. The house is gone now, but it was just like many that are still standing and still occupied by the poor. 70 years ago, the poor who lived here were mainly Jewish, Irish, and Italian, and a way out and up for a young man with ambition was often through politics. But first, there was growing up to do, and there was the Boys Club. Here at 10th Street and Avenue A, the Boys Club continues to help neighborhood youngsters. It was here that Louis Lefkowitz came for recreation.
What was it like growing up poor on the Lower East Side?
Well, you can write a book about that. It wasn't easy, it was very difficult, but everyone else was in the same poverty conditions, so it was a way of life. You knew no better. You accepted this is the way it is, because every neighbor was that way, regardless of their religious faith. Every block had the same kind of people. The houses were pretty much the same. Here and there was a house that was a little different. Most of them were cold water flats. Many of them did not have the bathroom in the apartment. You had to go either in the floor where you lived or into the yard. Many of those homes, at night, you have to go down 3, 4 flights into the yard to go to a bathroom. They had no showers. Some didn't even have any tubs. In the very first room that you entered, we called that the kitchen. As you entered, there was a tub in which mother would wash the clothes, and that same tub is where you took your tub, your bath. And very often a neighbor would come in, or a relative, and walk in, and some were eating in the kitchen, and someone else was taking a bath in the kitchen. This is the sight you saw, Ken. It's very poor, and meals were not expansive meals. I mean, you ate whatever you could. As a kid, I know many a time after a swim, bread and mustard was many a meal for a lot of us. It cost a penny at that point for a piece of bread and some mustard. I remember very often when we felt like we were going somewhere. A lot of us started to work at the age of 12 and 13 and 14. My first job, I was 12 years of age. I was an errand boy. I made the mistake, instead of using the car fare to deliver the bundles, I was told by the older fellas, look, don't be silly, keep the dime, but hitch on a truck and you'll deliver the bundles you get back. But I was so late in getting a truck that it took me too long to deliver the bundles. And the fella come back and said, it took you 4 hours, it'd only take you an hour if you took the subway up and back. And that happened to a lot of us. And in addition to working in those days, that helps you a little bit. It was a rare thing. I mean, the movies in those days was 2 for a nickel, Ken. 2 for a nickel. If you took a girl with you, you had to sit on the same seat. A lot of guys didn't mind that. And very often we brought a meal in. That used to be bad because you had the odors from some of the food, with such combinations. But they wanted to get rid of you, so you often they'd empty out the theater, unlike today where you can sit through a performance unless you got scheduled performances. Then in those days when the performance was over, you had to empty out. You didn't have many luxuries, Ken. If you were of the Jewish faith, you got a suit when you were 13 for your bar mitzvah, and you couldn't wear that suit till your bar mitzvah day. And our Gentile people had their confirmations the same way. They'd save for a dress. The folks would put aside money for education. That was their primary objective, to see that you got good education. It was tough on your parents because your father, the average parent, worked in what we call a sweatshop. Those are the factories with endless hours, poor sanitary conditions, difficult conditions to work on. Then very often that would be supplemented by what your mother would do at home. She brought in homework. Oh, she would do a little sewing, a little knitting, plucking from the feather, the stem, and that would take a little time. So between that enabled you to pay for the rental and for food. All I can tell you was tough, Kenny, but maybe at the same time it made you appreciate later on, when you made $1, what life was all about. It wasn't easy, Ken. There was a great feeling of neighborhoods in those days. You don't have it now. Very, very little it around. It We got along very well with people, Jew and Gentile. We had my area Italians, Irish, German. No problem. The boys would fight. We had street fights sometime, but we'd help out our Gentile friends at holidays. Their holidays, we'd come in and help them with some errands or store chores, and they'd come to the Jewish people, help them out on Friday night to light the gas. Mostly coal stoves in those days. Swimming was in a boat. Sometime a boat would come around a dock, and you'd go swimming one day for boys, one day for girls. In the nude, you never went home with the same clothes, Ken. You'd leave in the morning with a pair of sneakers and a pair of shorts. They put 50, 60 fellas in one large room. The first one out of the pool grabbed the first thing he saw, usually something better, which he came, Ken. And when you got home, you really got a tongue lashing. You might have gone out with something new that day.
Did you then change the next day?
No, you didn't know who it was half the time. You'd have to wait 2 days later. You might recognize you. Hey, those sneakers were mine. Then there'd be a street fight. Or the clothes he wore. But a fellow who took it knew better. He didn't come around too soon. Maybe he dirtied up a bit so you don't recognize it.
What was the role of the boys' club those days in your life?
This was an institution that attracted us to go there. They urged us to come and spend our time there. So instead of being on the streets looking for trouble and making trouble, they got us up at an early age. Oh, at the age of 9, 10, 11, they gave us movies twice a week and some gym. That kept us busy. And if you didn't have gym, you'd then sit down, you'd play a little pool, read a book, and as you got older, you formed a club, and they had a college advisor who came gratis from some of the best colleges and acted as your advisor at meetings. And the fundamental thing, Ken, it taught you right from wrong. It taught you the good things in society. You never had in mind about, well, we had people stealing in those days. We had some bad fellas too, but the majority were not. And anyone going to a boys' club, rarely did we have a boys' club man or anyone from a settlement house. We had University Settlement, Henry Street Settlement, Christodora House, College Settlement. Rarely did we find anyone who spent any amount of reasonable time in a settlement house getting into difficulty. And I make that statement and defy anyone to tell me I'm wrong about it. There were some exceptions, but mainly no. And then you developed that up, and you started as an early age, and you kept doing it in your teenage and in the early 20s. That's why there's a boys' club alumni now.
You would go on trips?
We'd go to camp, not trips. We went to camp for $2. Not to have you feel you're getting charity. They asked
$2?
You for $2, took in for 2 weeks. You met at the boys' club on 10th Street and Avenue Way. A Fifth Avenue bus took you to the Penn Station. The Penn Station, they took us out to William Carey Camp. That's in Riverhead, Long Island. For $2, we had no valises. When you think of how mothers sit up there and sewing on tags, all you had was a pair of sneakers which you wore. You had a pair of shorts, and all you had, we wrapped our stuff in a newspaper, not in any bags or this impossible newspaper, with a piece of corduroy rubber band or without it. Half the things were falling out by the time we got to camp. And out there you went swimming in Long Island Sound in the nude. So all you had was maybe, you had a pair of sneakers, 1 or 2 pairs of shorts, and a couple of undershirts. That was your whole thing.
Tell us about the hot dogs they used to feed you.
Oh, brother. It'll make me laugh. I'll have to tell us why laughing. Like all kids, as you do now, there was a dog around the camp that we all adopted as a mascot and loved the dog. Well, one day we had frankfurters for lunch, and some wise guy spread the rumor. And by about that time, the dog wasn't seen that whole day. And someone spread the rumor after we had the hot dogs for lunch that the dog that had been our mascot, you know why that dog isn't around? Because that was the subject of our meeting. Well, everyone turned sick and green. And we started writing letters to come home. But thank God the dog showed up the next day. And everybody was well again. I'll never forget that incident as long as I live. And then, of course, a farm was a new thing to a boy from the Lower East Side. And there were a lot of farms out there. And sometimes we'd go to the farm and we thought it was public property. Some of the fellas forgot and they started taking some fruit until the farmers went after us. But, and then even out there, they pursued that civics and education and right from wrong. It was great. Ken, I said this to you, you and I have talked, with all due respect to the government spending, if I had my way, they made me a czar for spending the money for youth. I'd spend the bulk of it for settlement houses, for the boys' club. And there's no doubt in my mind you see a difference in many a fellow who otherwise gets into trouble. There'll be some exceptions, of course, but by and large, it'll do the most good in that area more than any other place I know of.
Another mandatory stop on the campaign trail is New York's Garment District. Louis Lefkowitz has been through so many campaigns, he's on a first-name basis with many who work there. We took him back to 7th Avenue and 37th Street. Though he's not running for the first time in over 2 decades, many of these friends remain faithful.
People have never had any difficulty deciding what to call you. It's Louis.
Correct.
Why is that? I mean, you've been a judge, you've been Attorney General, you've been an officer in the services. Why Louis?
Well, I like to feel it's an affectionate way of calling me. I don't mind it, you see. It's the reaction you give. Now, I walk the street, a cab driver, I'll, hey, Louis. Teacher, a cop, you name it. If you walk the street, you'll find it happening all the time. I don't mind it. To me, it's a manifestation of, they feel at home with me, and I've made them feel at home. Maybe it's because of my attitude of not thinking the world rests on my shoulder, but I'm plain, the same plain guy I was, even though I've had the benefit of nice titles of public office, and I've done very well. So I think it's an attitude they get depending on your attitude to them when you meet them. Not to feel high or big or unavailable, and then to speak the ordinary language. You see, I still have people tell me some trace of the Lower East Side. I'm not ashamed of it. When I ran for AG the first time in '58, any number of people said, would you take some lessons? I said, what's the trouble? Well, maybe you can change your East Side accent. I said, forget about it. I said, it won't be me. I said, I won't be comfortable. People take it for what you are. And if you think you're teasing or kidding people, you're mistaken. They can tell pretty much, Ken, if you're trying to put on the airs, if you're not what you should be or are.
Can you tell I'm uncomfortable calling you Mr. Attorney General?
No, I've had some people do that, you see, but Louis is what I prefer it for some reason. In fact, some call me judge, they don't call me general.
Tell me about handshaking. It's always, we were talking earlier about how Averell Harriman, when he was governor, would shake hands.
Limp, yeah, you never had a real handshake, but people like when you shake their hand, especially in campaigning, they like to feel that they're at home with you, that's it, that they're the one, and you got to feel it. You got to get over a feeling that you mean what you're doing, not just for form's sake, not just for conventional reasons, but that you mean what you're doing. And you got to do that when you campaign too, Kenny. They got to feel that you're looking at them, that you believe in them, and that they're very important people.
How do you save your hand from getting crushed? I mean, I've always thought that maybe the trick was to get your hand all the way in there.
No, I do it, but I get away as fast as I can. I give you a handshake and then pull it. Do it as fast as I can.
So I don't have time to squeeze it?
Well, either that or hold on to it, and I can't, then you're making me miss several people, Ken. I like the one-on-one, you got to keep moving around.
Where is your favorite, or what is your favorite place to campaign?
Well, there's several in that category. Of course, there are people that what I call captive audiences, where you don't have to send out a flyer or advertise on radio or TV, you're going to be there. You'll always get people coming out of the subway between 7:30 and 8:30 is ideal. And my favorite spots are 14th Street and 4th Avenue, 34th Street and BMT, the 8th Avenue sub at 53rd Street and Lex. There's a couple of Times Square area where you always get hundreds and hundreds of people. That's one place.
You don't find people gruff that early in the morning?
Well, you gotta know how to handle them. If a lot of people are running, you figure they gotta punch a clock. Don't try to bother them. And people going home, don't try to stop. You got to do that in the morning. Going home, they're hungry, they want to get home, they got a date, so you'll antagonize them. Now, what you do, it's a soft shell when you talk to them. You just say, I'm Louis Lefkowitz, I'm Ken Auletta, I'd like to say hello to you. You don't often have to say I'm running for office if you're an incumbent. Just remind them about your name. Or may I say hello? And if some people stop and they want to discuss an issue, you're glad to do it. But most people don't want to be bothered. Now, you got to watch this, Ken. If they come over to you, that's a good sign. But you got to force yourself on them, then you're in trouble. They're just being nice. So I observe all those things. And you go back after a morning in a subway or a morning in a department store, you ask me about my favorite places. And that means a lot to me. It's the reaction they get when I first approach them. And you can pretty well determine how you're doing in different parts of the city by a willingness on their part to seek you out. Some will say you're doing a good job. Others will say, glad you're running again. Other people, just to be nice, as good Americans, will just be very nice and acknowledge it. They're stiff, they'll stay away. You got to come force yourself on them. Well, you get a feeling that perhaps you haven't done enough to make them happy, or that there's no reaction. So you keep observing those things. And I'll often get into crowded places where there's a captive audience. I mentioned stores, I mentioned the subways, or just get on a corner. You don't have to do any advertising. Just send some advance people a half an hour in advance with a big sign and let them get a loudspeaker, a bullhorn, simply say, at 12:30, Ken Auletta will be here running for Congress. Louis Lefkowitz will be here. And that excites some people. Keep moving around, but at least you're letting some those that want to wait know you're coming. Then you get on a certain corner and you watch them coming from all directions and you try to greet them in a nice way. And people like that. I'm convinced, Ken, that between that day when you meet them on election day, if you made any kind of impression of being warm and sincere, of being willing to meet them, as distinguished from the fact they didn't meet your opponent, that can make a difference very often. Some, on the other hand, will have a chance to talk to you, and the way you respond will make a difference. Others are listening in as you respond to someone. All those things together make an impression.
When we talk about all the names you've mentioned, you didn't have a cross word to say about anyone. I asked you who the greatest person you ever met. Who is the least impressive public official you ever met?
Well, there may be so many in that category, it'll be hard to single them out.
You're not answering.
I know I'm not. Take a little time, I'd have to do a little thinking. You meet people that you say to yourself, I don't think he belongs in public life, without giving names. They don't follow things up. You get a feeling they don't care. Some are in public life thinking it's just a job. They get paid a salary. There's quite a few in both parties. There's no question about it. And you form those opinions in your own mind, and that remains with you. Then you meet others who are go out of their way and give it a lot of time. They're devoted to the thing. They could be making more money in private practice but don't, or private business but don't. You got to like this. You don't belong in public life unless you like it and you're determined to do a job in the public interest. It doesn't mean you got to please everyone. You can't please everybody, Ken. Very often when you interpret the law, people don't like that either. We have to defend every law in the state when it's attacked. Many of the laws I would not have voted for if I sat as a member of the legislature, but once it's on the books, it has a presumption of being constitutional, and we've got to defend those laws. We get many a letter criticizing the office. Why do you defend this law, Mr. Lefkowitz? We write back. That's my statutory oath, and that's my requirement by law.
You've been in public life for more than 50 years.
Just about from 1927, yeah.
How has public life changed in those years?
Well, let me intertwine it with the word politics. We had clubs in those days, and yes, the bulk of them were fine. Here and there, some of the leaders got into difficulty, which was regrettable. But by and large, the political clubs in my early days of all political parties served a great community or neighborhood function. In the poorer districts, this was a haven for the poorer people who, most of them were not citizens. We helped them become citizens by teaching them a little civics, how to sign their name, how to read a bit. But that eventually became the subject of a test when they went to be naturalized. Others, we gave them the use of the club for a Red Cross meeting or a neighborhood meeting or a Boy Scout meeting, so it served that purpose. Then there were a lot of the neighborhood kids that wanted to go to work and couldn't find jobs. In those days, you rented a newspaper, or you looked at buildings and looking for signs. They'd put signs outside, boy wanted, errand boy wanted. That's how you got your job. You go down to 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue, 3rd, and walk for miles and miles looking for a sign. Many people didn't advertise in the paper, didn't have the price for it. So the clubs would also recommend you for a job, either in a post office, Christmas time, or elsewhere. Then a lot of the tenants had difficulty with their landlords. They'd come up with their dispossessed. Dispossessors were a very frequent thing for non-payment of rent. One of the toughest things to see is on the Lower East Side of Manhattan or in Harlem, on parts of the Bronx, see somebody, when you were dispossessed, they put your furniture on the sidewalk, took the stuff down to a marshal. People going by would put money into a cup or a saucer, and before the day was up, or 2 days, the rent that was owing to the landlord became filled up in the cup, and you'd give the rent, they put your stuff back. That happened so frequent. It was a tough thing to talk about, but that's the situation. And there was more discipline. So the club served that purpose of what I gave it. The jobs, I mentioned all those things, and frankly, sometimes a traffic ticket would come up there. They'd help a fellow with a traffic ticket to maybe lower the fine. Then we went to court for some of the neighborhood children who got into difficulty. You'd go up, landlord and tenant, husband and wife disputes. We went to court. This was all gratis. Then we helped a lot of boys become students and encouraged them to go to college by giving them some work where they can pay their way through school. And I suppose from that angle, and I know a lot of people came up to the club so they can find a place where they can be warm, because most of the tenements in those days were cold water flats. Cold kept the heat, and if you had no cold, you just lived in the cold water flats. A lot of them came up there to play a little cards and keep warm, then go home to sleep.
What changed that system? Was it that government began to perform many of the same functions that the party
That
used to
was
do?
one reason. And number two, I think as people got more affluent and did a little better economically, they had less reason for going to the club. If you have less reason for going to the club, immigration stopped at one point. So all those reasons that existed before became less and less. Then some leaders did the wrong thing by getting into difficulty in some cases which became the subject matter of publicity. So that died out. I might mention another thing. We had more discipline in those days, Ken. If you had a district leader, people are afraid to use that word. There's nothing wrong. That's the law to have a district leader. Still, the leaders are still required now. If you had a meeting, Ken, or even in early public life, if you had a meeting and there was a consensus arrived at by those who participated in the meeting, so long as you had your say, once the meeting was up and a decision was arrived at, we all stood by it. Today, very often, you'll see a meeting take place. People have a chance to voice their sentiment one way or the other and then come out of the meeting and get a headline because they want to show how they can disagree with the official who called it or the county chairman had called it. We had very little of that in those days. You had a consensus, even though it wasn't what your viewpoint was, you stood by it.
In those days, if you did dissent after an agreement was made, what was the discipline imposed?
Well, the discipline could be one of two things. The leader might feel that it was a discipline that you shouldn't have done. It was a dissent that you had no right to do it so long as you gave a good version of what took place, not just going out to criticize. He might not let you run again if you were a public official. Or he might put you in the back burner never to, if you weren't yet an official, kill your aspirations to become one. And then perhaps then be excluded from meetings in the future. Their attitude was, if I bring you in on a meeting, and so long as you've had your say with everyone else, maybe we're right and maybe you're wrong. So long as you're not giving up a matter of principle or some conviction. Most disputes have to do with implementation, Ken. Everyone sits down very often, agreed to do a certain thing. It's the how do you carry it out which becomes the argument. Is it better this way or that way? And that's really the dispute in most cases, the implementation.
So there weren't many primaries in those days. The party...
Very, 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 very few. Very few primaries. Very few primaries. It's not a bad thing to have primaries. Look, I'm for primaries so long as they're by contestants who have some merit, not just they want to enter a primary to hold up people. Too often, sometimes as I read, primaries are entered into, a fellow gets rewarded and then he drops the primary, gets a commitment. There are very few primaries, although primaries are a healthy thing. They're good, they'll bring out the best. That's why I'm very strongly for public financing. Too many men and women today do not enter into public life because they don't have the funds to campaign. And I'm a great believer in the government helping out with public financing, so long as the candidate is qualified, not just going into it for some lark.
When you ran first for office in the 20s, no television,
no radio,
no radio advertising, no bullhorn.
No, just lung power and shoe power. We spoke off the truck, off wagons, off ladders as late as 1 o'clock in the morning. We had audiences lasting till 1 o'clock in the morning. I walked myself every store I made 2-3 times. I went to every store in the area from top to bottom, east to west, north to south. You'd always meet a few customers, you'd meet the owners and give out your literature. That was prepared for me. I didn't have the money for literature. We did the talking off the truck, then I knocked the doors as much as I could. But during the day, I did the favors whenever I could, riding around for people, then constant, it was 24 hours a day.
Describe the favors or contracts, as it was called, and sometimes still is called.
Oh, sure. Well, number one, a tenant would get it dispossessed. They said, we don't have the money. So you'd go to court and plead with the judge to give them a little time to pay it.
They'd come to their assemblyman.
They'd come to the assemblyman if you had one. Sometimes we had one, they came to the club. And the leader would say to some young men and women who were ambitious, you take this, you take this, you take that. They were hoping they'd run someday. So if you had an incumbent, fine. If you didn't have it, those who had the aspirations ran around. This could be day and night work, or husband or wife dispute, which wound up sometime in a local magistrate's court. That was our inferior criminal court. You'd go down there to try to straighten out the dispute. Or a local storekeeper might have got a summons for not having hot water cleaning the glasses. So you went down a municipal term to get them a light fine if you could. Or you went down sometimes for people to become citizens. You would take them down and teach them up to the last minute. Now, don't forget, who's the president? How do you get elected a congressman? How many senators do you have? And he made them sign his name. These were people who had no schooling at all when they came from Europe, Ken. And just they had to stop to teach them how to sign their name. They had no schooling whatsoever. They could sometimes talk Italian or Hebrew, Polish, but they didn't know how to sign their name, and we just took the time. Some of the children would help them at home with Papa and Mama. We would supplement it.
Aside from voting for the party or for the candidate or office holder who provided the most services to them, did they vote on issues in those days?
Well, we had in those days the Republican Democrats disagreed on tariff. The Republican Party was the high tariff party, the Democrats was the low tariff. That's a thing of the past. Today, those are the one difference, and personalities. Now, I became a Republican because the people who ran the local Republican club, I felt very close to that. They stood in that local area anyway, head and above shoulders from the local Democratic club. Might be different elsewhere. Sam Koenig was a former Secretary of State, appealed a lot to me. Gustav Hartman was a city court judge and also the man who, I think, established, as far as I can recall, the very first orphan asylum on the Lower East Side. That meant a lot to me, too. And we had some other people, business people that I warmed up to. Then, of course, I always said publicly, I got a little upset that, by October, November, I got a little upset with the Tammany Hall inspector, who was always a Democratic city, giving out summonses and telling the people, take the summons up to the local Democratic club, they'll take care of it for you. That boiled me up no end. So those are two reasons I joined, but I have no regrets. Today, there's very little difference. You're voting today on personalities. There are issues here and there, but by and large, they're voting on personalities and who campaigns better. And of course, if you have a good platform, they vote on that too. But most people today are all for reducing taxes, and cutting the expenses down, and there's great social programs. There is some difference now in other parts of the country and parts of the state. More conservative people than more liberal people.
Why are you, generally you tend to be identified more with, or probably closer to, say, the liberal Democrats, who are in the majority in the Democratic Party here, than you are, say, the conservative Republicans.
I am. Well, partly because of my background, let's face it, Kenny. Partly because of where I come from, having known poverty, having lived with poverty, and known how important it is to help people out that need help, not for the phonies, the people that need it. I'm progressive. I believe in trying to get housing for people and other social advantages where you can help them out so long as they deserve it, and that's my inclination. I'm progressive that way. Although I always respect another viewpoint. I have never had trouble getting votes from conservative because after they have their say, I argue my say, but I don't condemn them for it. They're sincere about this thing. I'm not talking about the extremists, either extreme left or extreme right. There's a viewpoint people are entitled to have, and you got to respect that viewpoint. And you get a lot of good out of discussing things with them. Again, I use the word implementation. You can have an idea, Ken, and think that's the only idea. Yet when you listen to other people, you might take part of it and fit it into what you have and then get the perfect solution. It's always good to listen to people.
We've talked about the changing nature of politics. I'm struck by something you said about the changing nature of political ethics. You, for instance, mentioned that the Democratic Party, and presumably Republicans, would fix tickets.
Oh, sure.
And yet just several years ago, some politicians were indicted for fixing tickets. Do we now say that things are illegal that formerly were once very acceptable?
Well, what we did in those days is we try to get a reduced fine for them, or sometimes make a plea that the fellow had no intention. Now, because there were times when you heard, you can't deny it, that there was talk that some people would take the ticket from you and say, go home, don't worry. That's what you'd call fixing tickets. Today, first of all, they don't go to the clubs anymore, Kenny. It's a thing of the past. You can't do today what happened years ago. There's no judges now that'll take a ticket. Jury notice were a thing you could take care of years ago. That's a very difficult thing today. The judges properly now require the prospective juror to come to court and give his excuse. So I think the opportunities have fallen away. They've disappeared more than they did before.
But in fact, many politicians are confused as to what is acceptable, good, legal, ethical.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong in helping a person if you can help them get a job. There's nothing wrong with that. I think there's nothing wrong if you send a lawyer down to say if a person is sick or disabled and he wants a little time to remedy a situation which is brought to court. I see nothing wrong in that. Fixing is to be condemned. That's entirely wrong. By fixing is something where you, without a hearing, you just tear up and just adjudicate. That's absolutely wrong, and it has no place in our society today. That's less and less of this is going on.
You've been embroiled in some controversies in your public career. One was in 1974, after then Assembly Speaker Perry Duryea was indicted for supposedly violating the state election law.
Correct.
By setting up a bogus committee and sending out 80,000 pieces of literature, encouraging people to vote for the Liberal Party, thus siphoning votes away from the Democrats in 12 assembly districts. At the time, you had referred this case to the Manhattan District Attorney, and Mr. Duryea's wife, Betty Duryea, sent telegrams to national Republican leaders accusing you and Nelson Rockefeller of political assassination of her husband. What happened?
Very simple. Newsday, which is a Long Island newspaper, had its own investigation. And they uncovered what to them looked like a violation of law. At that time, Ken, as the Attorney General, we had the jurisdiction to investigate election frauds, election violations. We don't have it now. They turned over their papers to me. We made an investigation. I had no right to prosecute, merely to investigate. And it was my duty, and that's all I did was discharge my responsibility by sending to the district attorney where the alleged violations took place. It happened that the alleged violations took place in New York County. And I forwarded to District Attorney Frank Hogan the file, the result of our investigation. He thereafter pursued it pursuant to his duty. And the grand jury, as you know, based on presentation of evidence by his office, returned some indictments which were later dismissed. I've been asked this question before. What I did was in discharge of my responsibility. If I didn't do it, some people would say you covered up. I just did what I've done now for 22 years. I've got a lot of investigations that have hurt people or affected people that I know personally, either politically or otherwise, but that's my job. You've got no right to be in public life unless you're ready to discharge it. I got a simple answer, Ken. We don't create these things. They're created by people themselves. I'm on speaking times with Perry Duryea. I'm helping him in his present campaign as well, but I think he realized that this was my duty, and I did it. I had no choice about what I did.
The charges against Mr. Duryea were dropped, dismissed by the judge.
Correct.
But the Judge Roberts, did call the actions of Duryea and his supporters, quote, calculated falsehood. Legally, they cleared him, but ethically, the judge condemned.
That was his expression, right?
What would be your expression?
Well, frankly, we did the investigation. I didn't. What was done should not have been done. Put it that way. It had to, as you say, to siphon off votes, and I think it was more the enthusiasm of people around him than Mr. Duryea himself. No, I never saw the evidence on which he was indicted. I never saw the grand jury minutes, so I have no idea whether there was a connection or not. All I do know that from what we knew as we sent it on, the activity was by the people who were part of his office and some who were not part of his office who were called in.
One of your appointees, former appointees, Maurice Najari,
Yes.
was a man who many in politics felt had a very jaundiced view, almost a bigoted view towards politics, where he assumed that most people in politics were crooks. Was that your perception of Maurice Najari?
My perception was he was overzealous, perhaps that's being the kinder way of putting it, I think. In his appraisal of evidence, perhaps he was overzealous and maybe didn't weigh it strong enough. But he was sincere in what he was doing. He was devoted to doing a job. He had a good background coming from Frank Hogan's office with a good record down there. And he strongly felt, as he often told me, that where he found some of that smoke, there was fire, and he felt he had enough evidence. It's seen now by virtue of the decisions, Ken, which have reversed some of the convictions or throughout the indictments, that perhaps their evidence was lacking and that he was overzealous and maybe too often didn't give the benefit of the doubt to the person being investigated, but looked on it from his side of it. You know what's happened since, what happened to a lot of the cases. But he had a good staff. He worked hard. He worked around the clock. And that's the best word I can use, and maybe a wrong appraisal or just being overzealous in his job.
The public today is pretty fickle. Andy Warhol once said that the life span of a celebrity is about 15 minutes. And in fact, most politicians, incumbents included, lose elections after a period of time.
Right.
Why have you escaped that harsh judgment of a fickle electorate?
Well, first, I think I and there are others like me who worked at the job all year round. To me, it was an all-day job. Of course, you slept at night at home, but or elsewhere, wherever you went to functions. But I'd like to think that people in public life are campaigning all the time, campaigning in the sense that they're doing their job. Number two, I think I was available. And I met you at a lot of functions where a lot of people say, what, he could be sitting home now. Otherwise, there are certain institutions that have annual affairs, you'd make them, certain charities, some people being honored. And that as you went to these functions, your availability of discussing things and taking a decent attitude and not just looking like you're doing people a favor. People don't like to feel you're doing them a favor, Ken. And if they like you personally, sometimes that's more important to them than some great issue. Many votes are cast on personalities rather than on issues. Everyone doesn't read an editorial. Everyone doesn't follow a campaign. Everyone doesn't read literature. So very often it'll be on a personality, if you got warmth, if you're sincere in what you're doing. And I think because people had a feeling that I was responding. In my case, if I may say so, not boastfully, just factually, I changed the role of the AG's office. When I started in 1958, 1957, I should say, when I was appointed by the legislature, and since then I was elected 5 times. The main and only role of the Attorney General was to defend the lawsuits brought against the state and its various agencies. I thought then, and I'm glad I did, that the role could be changed to include, keep the old role, but include some affirmative things. So I started a Consumer Frauds Bureau in the Attorney General's office, Charity Frauds Bureau, public real estate financing of condominiums, co-ops, all stuff that started under my career and since I've been Attorney General. Charitable foundations. These are all new areas where you don't wait for an agency of government to be sued or wait for them to send you papers to defend them, where affirmatively your staff creates the good for the public good. And I think that helped me considerably with people, with that image of being, if I may use the word, the people's lawyer. I'll never forget Rockefeller said, well, all the money we pay for Madison Avenue, where'd you get it from, Louis? I said, that was my own creation. He said, that's the best thing in the world you did for people's lawyer.
What are you going to do when you retire this January?
Well, no problem. I made up my mind when I announced my retirement on March 1st that first I would get associated with a law firm. I've now been interviewed by several law firms. I've made no decision yet. Number 2, I hope to teach maybe one night a week. I've had several schools speak to me, and I'm holding that in abeyance until I first firm up what law firm I'll be with. And that'll depend how much time I give there, then I'll make my commitment to how much teaching I can do. Third, I want to spend more time with my family. And last but not least, I'm active in a hospital. I'm active as a trustee in some college. I want to give a little bit more of some pro bono work and some work to help out with charity and people of that.
What about the Boys Club?
I hope to be asked to serve on the board of trustees of the Boys Club. A lot of business people are on, and I've indicated my willingness to do it as soon as I can after the first of the year.
20 years from now, you're sitting in Ratner's eating a blintz. Your great-great-great-grandchildren come in. They read the history books. What would you like them to read about Louis Lefkowitz, Attorney General, 22 years?
Well, again, let me thank you first for having me around 20 years from now. What I'd like them to think of is that of this great country, of the opportunities it gave me, that you can be born of poor parents and yet the education is available, that the institutions are here to take advantage of, and that if you pursue the institutions and attend them with eagerness, you could make good. There's a lot of opportunity in this country. That I was a very lucky fellow to go to school, get an education from our public school and our high school system, become a lawyer and enter public life, which can happen nowhere else in this world. So it's one of gratitude from their grandfather, great-great-grandfather, whatever you want to make of me, Ken. That's the feeling I'd like to have them feel, that I started with limited opportunities and made good only because there was available to me the institutions of this great country.
Thank you, Lou.
Thank you, Ken.
The 13 presentation of a conversation with Louis Lefkowitz was made possible by a grant from the David J. Green Foundation.